to say that reading from about Elijah in that first reading, that's one of my favorites. Here's Elijah just taunting them, making fun of them, these prophets of Baal, And then when he calls on God, not only is the sacrifice burnt, but even the stones in the water is gone. Incredible moment. In the early 13th century, early 1200s, a very young man decided that he wanted to give his life over to God. And so young Ferdinand entered the Augustinian monks, and he really wanted to enter into a life of prayer. And so in Lisbon, Portugal, this young man entered into a life of prayer among the Augustinian monks, and he began to grow very rapidly in the spiritual life. He had a heart that was just so open to God. And then he sought to go deeper in the life, deeper in prayer. So he asked to be transferred to a monastery that was more remote. So his superiors sent Brother Ferdinand over to the monastery in Coimbra. And there in Coimbra, Portugal, he was ordained a priest, and just a very quiet, subdued fellow who was just so wanted to just love God in the silence of contemplation. Then one day, a bunch of guys were passing through. Part of this new community, these followers of Saint Francis of Assisi. He wasn't considered a saint yet. They just called him Brother Francis from Assisi. And Francis had sent these group of fellas to go to Morocco to preach to the Muslims and convert them. So on their journey to Morocco, they stopped by the friary in Coimbra and, got a meal there or so and moved on. They got to Morocco, and these friars sent by St. Francis to convert Muslims were all martyred, suffered horrible deaths at the hands of the Muslims. And through some politics, whatever, their bodies were able to be sent back to Portugal, and they'd be buried in the chapel in Coimbra, where Brother Ferdinand was living. Now these friars who were martyred for the faith, St. Berard and companions, were the first martyrs of the Franciscan order. When St. Francis heard the news that his brothers were killed for the faith, he rejoiced and said, now I can say I have true brothers in heaven, because they died for the faith of Christ. Now young Ferdinand was there as they brought the bodies of these martyrs of the faith and buried them in the vault of the church there, and he was so moved by their witness. He felt this interior call in his heart to be an evangelist, to go preach, to convert souls to God. More than just prayer, that deep prayer led him to desire the salvation of souls. And so young Ferdinand went and found the friars and said, I want to join with you. And so he was given permission. And so young Brother Ferdinand took off his Augustinian habit and put on his Franciscan robe. And because of his devotion to prayer, he decided to take on himself a new name after the first desert hermit. And so he took the name Anthony and became known as Father Anthony. And Father Anthony wanted to go out and preach to the Muslims, and he went off and got into a boat with the friars, another group of guys going to the missions, and they're going to go preach to the Muslims, and their boat got turned off course. And they wind up shipwrecked in Italy. So he makes his way through Italy, and he gets away with the other brothers. They finally reach Assisi, and he gets to meet St. Francis. And he and all the brothers are there. All the brothers of the world are gathered, and they're getting sent out all over the place. And St. Francis is so impressed by Father Anthony that he sent him to go be a cook in a friary. And so obediently, Father Anthony became a cook in the friary. That was his job, to cook for the brothers. No major apostolate. He'd say Mass every day, but then he was the cook. And he was very happy being the cook. He figured, okay, God wants me back into prayer, so I'll do simple jobs, be the cook and pray. I guess my desire to be a preacher wasn't going to happen. So he's going about his business cooking, and one day they're talking at table, the brothers, and they say, one of the Dominicans is going to get ordained a priest, and somebody has to preach at his ordination, and they want a Franciscan to preach at this Dominican's ordination. And nobody wanted to do it. So they said, Father Anthony, you're going to be the cook. Why don't you preach? So Father Anthony said, okay, I want me to go preach, I'll go preach. And he never stopped preaching after that. That young friar who had been a an Augustinian monk from Portugal, now living in Italy, got to that pulpit and he just let out a sermon that moved the hearts of everyone. And then he was asked to preach here, and to preach there, and preach here. And his voice would carry. And he could preach to a crowd of 30,000 people without a microphone. Probably had a voice like mine. His voice that would just echo the mountains, and they could hear him. And he would preach so powerfully. His words would pierce the hearts of people, and they would be converted. They'd want to go to confession. They want to change their lives because of the preaching of this young priest. He was only in his late 20s, maybe mid-20s. This young priest, there was such power behind his words, and that power came from this intense life of prayer. And then they began to realize that he wasn't so dumb. He's actually a pretty intelligent guy. And they realized he was quite the theologian. He was brilliant, this young priest, this young Father Anthony. He was so brilliant that they began to go to him for advice and direction on theology. Eventually, his reputation got back to St. Francis of Assisi. And St. Francis was starting to, he was thinking about, brothers were talking about it, opening up their own school of theology to teach the brothers, to train them for the priesthood. But Francis was very leery about learning because he said, I don't want the brothers getting all, arrogant once they get an education. Guys who study for the sake of studying to say, oh, I studied. He wanted guys to study so that they could truly love God. And that through studying theology, they would come to know God and love God. So Francis was very particular. So he thought about who could he assign the task of teaching theology. And then he decided to write a letter. Dear Brother Anthony, my bishop. Why he called him a bishop, I don't know. I give you permission to teach theology to the brothers so long as you do not extinguish the spirit of prayer. Of all the people in the order, the 5,000 friars of the order, he decided that this young, probably now maybe 30 years old priest should teach theology to the brothers. So first he went to Bologna to brush up, Brother Anthony, brush up on his theology, and then he opened up the first Franciscan school of theology and became the Franciscan theologian that opened the doors to so many things. It's another homily for another day, what the Franciscans gave in the field of theology. But Brother Anthony was the one who taught theology to the brothers, the only one that St. Francis trusted. Eventually, he moved to Padua. And from henceforth, for the rest of eternity, he's known as Anthony of Padua. That's the basic life path of Saint Anthony of Padua. This young man who just had this thirst and the desire for prayer, entered into prayer, and then followed his heart's longing to live the gospel, proclaim the gospel. And when the word was given for him to preach, he preached. And his words, because they were backed up by years of prayer and knowledge of God, he was backed up by penance. It began to pierce the hearts of his listeners, and his voice would carry. And even the people in the furthest back, their hearts too were pierced by the word of the Lord and brought to conversion. And this young priest was given the grace by God to instruct others in theology, to teach them, to truly love God through knowing God. Not just to study one's theology, but to pray with it, to reflect upon the beautiful mysteries of God. And he set the school of theology into place that to this day bears such great fruit in the church. This incredible young man, he died at the age of 36 years old. 36, he was so young. Oftentimes we see statues of St. Anthony. He's so skinny. He wasn't. He was fat. Much like St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, he had dropsy, so he retained water, but he was a big guy. The statues never do him justice. He was a big guy. I remember Mother Angelica saying, if you're fat, don't worry about dieting. Be a fat saint. She said, I'm fat. St. Anthony was fat. St. Thomas Aquinas was fat. Just be a fat saint. So I take comfort in those words. But truly, he ended his life. His last years was spent. Again, people just crowded around him all the time. To get away from the crowds, to give himself to prayer, he actually built a tree house next to the friary. And he began to live in a hermitage in a tree house. And then when all the people would gather, he'd preach from his treehouse, and he would shut the doors and go back to prayer. incredible saint of the church. This young man who was just a kid from Lisbon, Portugal. Yeah, he was the son of a nobleman and all that, but what God did with him when he gave himself to God, what God was able to do through this young man who died at such a young age. How is it that this young man is known throughout the whole world, one of the most popular saints in history? Just simply because he loved God. That was the key. He loved God with such a tenderness of heart that Jesus even appeared to him as a child because of the tenderness of his love for Christ, which is why we always see him holding the Christ child, because he was given to hold the baby Jesus as a sign of his tender love for God and God's tender love for him. God trusted him so much that he was able to rest in Anthony's arms like a baby. How beautiful. So as we get ready to celebrate this beautiful feast of Saint Anthony on Saturday morning, each day we reflect upon our saint and we ask his powerful intercession. We'll talk about his power from heaven another day, but he's more than just the finder of lost things, more than just the guy who's trying to find your eyeglasses, car keys, and a parking spot for you. He is truly a powerful intercessor who wants more than to find your car keys, is to find you and everyone you love and bring you home to heaven. Maybe he is God's lost and found department. But most importantly for him is finding the lost sheep and bringing them home to the rejoicing of the saints and angels, to the rejoicing of God himself. May God bless you and Mary keep you.